My name is Cassandra Reed, and the worst day of my life began with 300 people clapping while my husband handed me a bouquet of white lilies and announced into a microphone at our own 10th anniversary party that he wanted a divorce and that everyone in that ballroom had known for 6 months, except me. And I stood there in a dress I'd had tailored twice to fit a body that had carried and lost 2 pregnancies for that man holding flowers that suddenly felt like they weighed 40 pounds, watching 299 faces I had fed and hosted, and remembered birthdays for refused to meet my eyes. And I want to walk you through everything that came before that microphone and everything that came after it, because it took me 4 years to understand that the humiliation in that ballroom wasn't the beginning of my destruction. It was only the moment I finally noticed it had already been happening for a very long time. And to understand that you need to understand who I was before I became the woman everyone in that room was too polite to look at. I grew up in a modest split-level house outside Columbus, Ohio, the only daughter of a pharmacist father and a mother who ran the front office of an elementary school. And I was the kind of girl who got straight A's without seeming to try, who organized her friends' birthday parties better than the parents did, who always noticed when someone in a room felt small and quietly worked to make them feel bigger, and that instinct, that particular gift for making other people comfortable, followed me into adulthood and eventually became both my greatest strength and the exact weakness that a small group of people would spend years learning how to exploit. I met Marcus Reed at 24 at a charity gala. I was working as an event coordinator and he was 31, already a partner at a mid-sized architecture firm, tall and easy, with a smile that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room, and he pursued me for 3 months with a patience I mistook for depth, sending flowers to my office with notes that referenced things I'd mentioned only once in passing, showing up to support a charity run I'd organized, even though he'd told me privately he found running miserable. And I fell for him the way you fall for someone who seems to be paying closer attention to you than anyone ever has, not realizing that attention and investment are not the same thing. That a man can study you carefully enough to know exactly which levers to pull without ever once loving what he finds underneath. We married when I was 26, and for the first 3 years, I want to be fair and say they were genuinely good. Years or good enough that the small warning signs. A comment here about how much weight I'd gained after our first miscarriage. A joke there at a dinner party about how I used to have ambitions before I got comfortable felt like isolated moments rather than a pattern. Because that's the thing about the particular kind of cruelty Marcus specialized in, it never arrives all at once. It arrives in doses small enough that you spend years doubting your own read of the room, wondering if you're the problem, if you're too sensitive, if you're imagining a chill in a house that everyone else insists is warm. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Reed, widow of a respected federal judge matriarch of a family that had occupied the same 6-bedroom colonial in the wealthiest part of our city for 3 generations, made her feelings about me clear within the first year of my marriage, not through outright hostility, which would have been easier to fight, but through a campaign of small, deniable erosions delivered always with a smile, correcting my table settings in front of guests, reminding me at every holiday gathering that Marcus's first serious girlfriend, a woman named Whitney Sinclair, whose family owned half the commercial real estate downtown, would have understood how to run a proper Reed household, introducing me to her friends, not as her daughter-in-law, but as Marcus's wife. She's from Columbus originally. A phrase she delivered with the exact inflection you'd use to explain a stain on a tablecloth. And I absorbed every one of these moments, the way I'd absorbed my whole life. The emotional temperature of every room I walked into quietly, without complaint, believing that if I simply worked hard enough at being gracious, at being useful, at being exactly what a Reed wife should be, eventually I would earn a place in that family that no one could question. I gave up my event coordinating career in our 4th year of marriage, not because Marcus demanded it outright. He was far too careful for anything that direct, but because he made it clear, through 1,000 small comments about how exhausting it must be to work such long hours, how nice it would be if I had more energy for entertaining his clients. how his partner's wives all seemed to manage their households so effortlessly that my career had become an obstacle to the version of me he actually wanted. And I told myself I was choosing this, that building a beautiful home and supporting his rising career was its own kind of ambition, and for years I filled that role completely, planning every dinner party that helped him land new commissions, remembering the names of every client's spouse and children, becoming without ever being credited for it. One of the quiet engines behind his firm's growing reputation for landing wealthy residential clients who wanted an architect their whole family could feel comfortable around. And I gave birth to our son Theodore when I was 31. After 2 devastating miscarriages that Eleanor had responded to both times, not with comfort, but with a barely concealed suggestion that perhaps my body simply wasn't suited to carrying Reed, children comments that Marcus never once corrected in my presence. Standing beside his mother in silence that I would only years later understand wasn't neutrality, it was complicity dressed up as diplomacy. Theodore became the center of my entire world in a way that surprised even me, and for 6 years, I built my identity almost entirely around being his mother, driving him to soccer practice and piano lessons, volunteering at his school, and if I'm honest, using his needs as a socially acceptable explanation for why I no longer had a career, no longer had close friends of my own who weren't also friends of Marcus's family, no longer had really very much of a life that existed independently of the Reed name, and it was sometime during Theodore's kindergarten year that I first noticed Marcus's assistant, a woman named Priya, 28 years old. Sharp and stylish, and endlessly suspiciously present, appearing at firm events I hadn't been specifically told about until after the fact, texting Marcus at hours that felt increasingly untethered from ordinary work needs, and when I raised it carefully, the way you raise something you're terrified of being wrong about Marcus's response was so smooth, so wounded, so convincingly hurt that I would even suggest such a thing, that I spent the following 2 years actively suppressing my own instincts every time they flared up again, apologizing to him at one point for not trusting him enough. A memory that still makes something in my chest tighten with a particular kind of shame reserved for the ways we betray ourselves on someone else's behalf. The affair, when I finally confirmed it wasn't discovered through any dramatic reveal. It was discovered because I found tucked into the zippered inner pocket of a garment bag I was packing for dry cleaning a hotel receipt from a business trip Marcus had taken 8 months earlier, a trip he'd told me was solo, a receipt for a suite, not a single room charged to a company card, on a date that also happened to be Priya Kapoor's out-of-office calendar entry, which I only knew because I still, out of old habit, had access to the firm's shared scheduling system from my years helping coordinate his client events. And I sat on that bathroom floor for over an hour, the receipt in my hand, feeling something in me go very quiet and very cold. A stillness I would later recognize as the first moment in 6 years. I had actually trusted my own perception of reality over Marcus's careful reconstruction of it. I confronted him that night, and he didn't deny it so much as he reframed it, told me the affair, which he now admitted had been going on for nearly 3 years, almost the entirety of Theodore's life, was something that had happened to him during a period when he felt, and I remember this phrase with a clarity that still makes my jaw tighten, emotionally starved in our marriage, as though his affair were weather, as though I were somehow the barometric pressure that had caused it. And when I told him I wanted a divorce that very night, he asked me calmly, almost gently, to wait to think about Theodore, to think about what a divorce would do to our son's stability. And I agreed, God help me. I agreed to wait to try counseling to give him a chance to prove the affair was truly over, not understanding that I was giving him something far more valuable than a second chance. I was giving him 18 additional months to prepare quietly and methodically for the divorce he had already decided he wanted, structured entirely on his terms. Those 18 months, I would later understand, were the period during which Marcus, with his mother's extensive help, built the entire architecture of my destruction with the same careful precision he brought to designing a house. Starting with a series of conversations, small and seemingly innocent, that Eleanor began having with mutual friends about how worried she was about me, how I seemed increasingly erratic and difficult, how she'd noticed me drinking more at family gatherings, which was a lie. I'd had perhaps 2 glasses of wine at any given event in years. But a lie repeated by a woman with Eleanor's social standing calcifies into perceived truth with frightening speed and continuing through a pattern I only fully reconstructed years later of Marcus documenting. In a journal, his lawyer would eventually submit as evidence a series of exaggerated and, in several cases, entirely fabricated incidents depicting me as an unstable, neglectful mother, including one particularly devastating claim that I had left Theodore unattended near our backyard pool for a period of 20 minutes while I was in his account, distracted by my phone. An incident that had genuinely happened, but which he'd stretched from the 90 seconds it actually took me to retrieve a ringing phone from inside the house while Theodore played in the shallow end under the direct supervision of our pool's motion alarm system, into a fictional near drowning that painted me as dangerously inattentive. When I finally told Marcus 18 months after discovering the affair that I was done trying, that I wanted the divorce, I should have demanded the night I found that receipt he suggested. With a magnanimity that I now recognize as pure theater, that we celebrate our 10th anniversary as planned before beginning the difficult process ahead, framing it as a chance for our extended family and friends to say goodbye to us as a couple with dignity. And I agreed still, even then still trying to be gracious. Still trying to make this easier for everyone except myself, and I spent 6 weeks planning that party, choosing the flowers, the caterer, the string quartet, pouring the same devoted energy into celebrating the end of my marriage that I had once poured into building it, not understanding until the actual night, until Marcus took that microphone in front of 300 guests, most of whom I would later learn had been quietly informed weeks in advance by Eleanor that Marcus finally worked up the courage to leave, that the entire anniversary party had never been a farewell gift to me at all. It had been the stage for my public execution, timed and choreographed to ensure that my humiliation would happen in front of the largest possible audience, that the story of our marriage's ending would be told first and told exclusively in his voice, framing him as a patient man, finally freeing himself from a marriage that had quietly, tragically become untenable, while I stood frozen holding flowers, unable to process fast enough to defend myself before he'd already moved on to thanking everyone for their support during what he called the hardest decision of my life. The months that followed the party unfolded with a speed that still even now takes my breath away when I trace it on a calendar. Marcus filed for divorce 11 days later, and his legal team, which I would learn had been retained nearly a year earlier, immediately requested emergency custody proceedings, citing concerns for the minor child's welfare. Submitting that fabricated journal along with sworn statements from 2 of Eleanor's closest friends attesting to my erratic behavior and excessive drinking at social events, claims that standing entirely alone might have been dismissed as unsubstantiated gossip, but which arrived in court alongside something far more damaging: a report from a court-appointed evaluator who had spent in total 90 minutes with me across 2 separate sessions, and whose report, I would only discover years later through records requests, had been influenced by a private conversation Eleanor arranged quietly, discreetly, entirely off the official record over lunch at a restaurant one of her oldest friends happened to co-own. A friend whose husband happened to sit on the same county bar association ethics committee that oversaw complaints against family court evaluators, and I have never been able to prove definitively what was said at that lunch. But I know the evaluator's final recommendation characterizing me as emotionally volatile, based almost entirely on my visibly distressed reaction to reading Marcus's fabricated journal entries during our second session, a reaction any reasonable person would have to being confronted with lies about their own child's safety, tilted the entire custody, proceeding decisively in Marcus's favor. I lost primary custody of Theodore 4 months after the anniversary party granted only supervised visitation twice a week for the first year, a ruling that landed on me with a violence no physical blow could have matched. Because it wasn't just the loss of my son's daily presence, it was the accompanying public verdict whispered through every social circle. Eleanor moved in that I was unfit and unstable, a woman who couldn't be trusted alone with her own child, a narrative that spread through our city's private school parent network with a speed I hadn't thought possible. resulting in me being quietly uninvited from the volunteer committees I'd chaired for years, watching other mothers at school pick up women I'd hosted in my home, women whose children's birthday parties I'd helped plan, angle their bodies away from me in the parking lot as though my presence were contagious. I lost the house in the settlement that followed, not through any legal necessity. The house was legally mine as much as his, but through 6 months of attrition, Marcus's legal team burying my exhausted, underfunded attorney in filing after filing, forcing decisions after decisions that each cost thousands of dollars. I no longer had steady access to since I'd spent the previous 6 years without independent income until finally, drained financially and emotionally, past the point of sustainable resistance, I agreed to a settlement that gave me a modest lump sum, nowhere close to half of what our combined assets were actually worth, in exchange for simply making the exhausting, expensive process end. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the unfashionable side of the city, the kind of place that made Theodore, during his supervised visits, ask in a small, careful voice why I didn't have a backyard anymore, a question that undid something in me every single time he asked it. And I want to be honest that for nearly a year after that move, I existed in a state that I can only describe as suspended. Going through the motions of survival, showing up for supervised visits, taking a job as an administrative assistant at a small architecture firm that had no idea of my history and mercifully no connection to Marcus's professional circles functioning. But only barely carrying a grief that had no clean edges, because it wasn't grief for a death. It was grief for a life that had been systematically dismantled by people who were technically still alive and still, in Theodore's eyes, still his father and grandmother people I could never fully escape or explain away to a 6-year-old who loved them without complication. The shift, when it finally came, arrived not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow accumulation of small observations that began ironically at my new job, where I discovered, 6 months in, a genuine talent I hadn't been permitted to use in years. An ability to read financial documents and identify inconsistencies that my new employer, a semi-retired architect named Harold Voss, who ran a boutique firm handling estate and property matters for wealthy families, noticed almost immediately and began actively cultivating, giving me increasingly complex projects, reviewing property trusts and estate valuations. Work that reawakened a part of my mind that had been dormant since college, and it was during one of these projects nearly a year into my job, reviewing a property trust structure for an unrelated client, that I recognized a particular legal mechanism, a specific type of irrevocable trust clause designed to shield inherited assets from division in a divorce. And something clicked into place with an almost audible sound, because I remembered suddenly and completely a conversation from years earlier, back when Marcus and I were still newly married, about a trust his father had established before his death, a trust I had never once seen the actual documents for. Always told vaguely that it was complicated and handled by the family's estate attorneys, and I began to wonder for the first time with genuine clarity rather than vague unease, whether Eleanor's campaign against me had been motivated purely by class snobbery, as I'd always assumed, or whether there had been something more concrete underneath it, some specific financial architecture she had been protecting all along. I started slowly and carefully using skills I was actively developing at my new job to research the Reed family's actual financial structure through public records property filings and, eventually, with Harold's blessing and occasional guidance, since estate law had become his genuine specialty, formal records requests. And what I discovered over the following 18 months reframed everything I thought I understood about why my marriage had ended, exactly when and exactly how it did. Because the judge's trust, established decades earlier, contained a specific and unusual provision, one that stipulated that Marcus's full inheritance, a sum that dwarfed anything I'd been led to believe existed, would only fully vest and transfer to him free of the trust's ongoing restrictions. Upon his 40th birthday, provided he remained at that time either unmarried or married to someone, the trust's oversight committee, composed of Eleanor and 2 of the judge's former law partners, formally approved as suitable. A provision I had genuinely never known existed in 7 years of marriage, one that made suddenly, sickeningly clear why Eleanor's campaign against me had escalated so precisely in the 18 months before Marcus's 40th birthday, which I confirmed. Checking my old calendar records had occurred exactly 4 months after our divorce was finalized, meaning the entire timeline, the affair's convenient discovery, the 18-month delay before filing the fabricated journal, the custody proceedings, the divorce finalized just in time, had not been the messy unraveling of an unhappy marriage at all. It had been a calculated operation executed with architectural precision to ensure Marcus's full inheritance vested without any obligation to share it with a wife, the trust's committee. Meaning Eleanor had never once genuinely approved of, and Priya Kapoor, I discovered through a record search that took another 4 months of patient digging, had married Marcus, 11 months after our divorce finalized. A marriage that occurred exactly 6 months before his 40th birthday, comfortably, within whatever window the trust's approval process required, and Priya, it turned out, had a detail in her own background that made the entire calculation even colder than I'd initially understood. Her father sat on the board of a commercial real estate investment firm that property records showed had begun a series of joint ventures with Marcus's architecture firm, starting almost exactly the same month the affair, by Marcus's own admission during our confrontation, had begun. I sat with this discovery for a long time before deciding what to do with it, because I understood with a clarity that surprised even me. That rage alone would accomplish nothing against people who had spent years demonstrating a talent for controlling every narrative around them. And so, I made a decision that took every ounce of patience I had left. I decided not to confront them, not yet, but to build something first, quietly, methodically. The way Harold had taught me to build a case for a property dispute, one verified document at a time. And I spent the next year doing exactly that, working with an attorney. Harold recommended a sharp, unflashy woman named Denise Okonkwo, who specialized in family law appeals and who listened to my entire story with a stillness that told me she believed every word before I'd even finished presenting my evidence. And together, we identified the specific legal avenue that gave me my actual path forward, not a reopening of the divorce settlement itself, which Denise warned would be nearly impossible to overturn at that stage, but a formal motion for custody modification built entirely around a discovery that had nothing to do with the trust and everything to do with something far more damning. The court evaluator, whose 90-minute assessment had shaped my entire custody outcome, had Denise's investigator confirmed, through records obtained via a formal ethics complaint, failed to disclose a personal friendship with Eleanor that predated my case by over a decade. A conflict of interest that, once formally documented and submitted to the County Bar Association's Ethics Committee alongside a parallel motion in family court, resulted first in the evaluator's license being suspended, pending a full investigation, and second, and far more importantly for my purposes, in the original custody ruling being formally vacated and ordered for complete reevaluation by an entirely new independent evaluator with no connections whatsoever to either family. The new evaluation, conducted over 4 months by a woman with a reputation for rigorous, unbiased assessment, painted a picture of my actual parenting. Consistent, loving, structured, entirely unremarkable in the best possible sense. So thoroughly at odds with the fabricated portrait Marcus's journal had constructed that the judge overseeing the modification, reviewing both evaluations side by side in a hearing 18 months after I'd first started my quiet research, remarked from the bench that the discrepancy between the two assessments was, in his words, deeply troubling and warranted further scrutiny of how the original custody determination had been reached. Scrutiny that, once Denise formally introduced the fabricated journal into evidence alongside a forensic document examiner's report, establishing that several key entries based on ink composition and paper aging analysis had actually been written retroactively, backdated to appear contemporaneous with events they falsely described, transformed the entire proceeding from a custody modification into something closer to a formal reckoning. And Marcus, facing the real possibility of perjury charges related to sworn statements built on fabricated evidence, agreed through his now considerably more nervous legal team to a revised custody arrangement granting me primary physical custody with Theodore. By then, 8 years old and increasingly able to articulate his own preferences to the court, expressing clearly and without prompting that he wanted to live primarily with me. The trust litigation that followed once I'd secured Theodore's custody, and therefore no longer feared retaliation against my access to my son, unfolded over another 2 years. Denise arguing successfully that the trust's marriage approval provision applied in a manner that had incentivized fraud misrepresentation and the psychological manipulation of custody proceedings purely to satisfy a financial deadline, constituted grounds for the trust's oversight committee to be held liable for damages. A novel legal argument that took considerable creativity to construct, but that ultimately succeeded, resulting in a settlement that, while it could never fully compensate for 4 years of my life spent fighting to reclaim my own son and my own reputation, gave me something I hadn't dared hope for at the start: genuine independent financial security. Along with a public court record, covered eventually by a regional business journal, that had long profiled Marcus's architecture firm as a rising local success story that laid out in exhaustive, damning detail exactly how the Reed family had orchestrated my public humiliation and false characterization as an unfit mother, purely to protect an inheritance. An article that Eleanor's social circle, the very same women who had once turned their bodies away from me in school parking lots, read with an appetite for scandal that I had once been the target of and was now, for the first time in years, watching turn decisively against someone else. Priya divorced Marcus within a year of the article's publication, taking with her, thanks to a prenuptial agreement I later learned Eleanor herself had insisted upon. A settlement calibrated with the same cold precision the family had once applied to me and the firm's client base, built so carefully over a decade on its reputation for trustworthy family-oriented residential work, hemorrhaged clients at a rate that forced Marcus within 3 years to sell his partnership stake entirely and relocate to a different city to start over under considerably diminished circumstances. And I want to tell you, I felt something enormous and cinematic watching all of this unfold, but mostly what I felt standing in the kitchen of the small house Theodore and I moved into once the settlement cleared. A house with a backyard he had specifically asked for was something quieter than triumph, something closer to the particular relief of finally exhaling after holding your breath for 4 straight years. Theodore is 13 now, and he still sees his father on a court-ordered schedule that I have never once tried to interfere with, beyond what safety genuinely requires, because whatever Marcus's failures as a husband, I have worked hard to let Theodore form his own relationship with his father without the weight of my own history distorting it, and I run now. A small consulting practice built on the exact skills that once helped unravel the case against me, helping women navigate exactly the kind of financial and custodial entanglements that once nearly destroyed my life, and I keep. In a drawer in my desk, a copy of that original fabricated custody evaluation, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of a specific and important lesson it took me 38 years to fully learn, which is that the people who hurt you the most quietly are often the ones counting on your gratitude for their restraint, and that the moment you stop mistaking someone else's careful cruelty for love, an entire version of your life that was never actually yours to begin with finally, completely falls away, leaving room for the one that was.